The Republic of Abkhazia is located on the Black Sea coast. Georgia considers it to be very much part of its territory, and officially it is indeed still part of Georgia, but it was created in the aftermath of a civil war in 1992-93 and has consolidated its position following the Georgian conflict in 2008 with Russia. So to all intents and purposes today it is at the very least quasi-independent, or indeed could in many ways be regarded as part of the Russian Federation. Despite its illegitimate status, I find that Abkhazia does come across as one of the more credible of the de facto republics to have emerged in the post-Soviet era. That said, it is a very surreal space to visit or travel around, due in no small part to the large number of very confronting ruins that you encounter left over from the war in 92-93. And what you're seeing here, for example, is the facade of the former Interest Hotel, which stands there really as a morose reminder, I suppose, of more glorious times. I think this image already goes some way to illustrating what I meant when I just said surreal space. This is actually in central Sukhum. This used to be a government building. It's been completely destroyed inside from the war in the 90s, but the facade, as you can see, still stands, and it does create a very strange feeling there. To this day, however, it's an important location, and major Abkhaz rallies and gatherings of people for various reasons take place at this site. So, speaking of gatherings of people, they are not unusual events there, and the Abkhaz are certainly very patriotic. They feel as though they've fought hard for their independence, and again, I don't particularly want to get too caught up in the politics of the situation, but as you can see, they do feel very strongly about where they come from, and whether one needs to distinguish between nationalism and patriotism here is a question that I'll leave you to decide. Historically, Abkhazia was an escape really for the Soviet elite, and you were fortunate if you were living there, because its idyllic location between the Black Sea and the mountains makes it a very, very nice part of the world to be, especially in the context of the Soviet Union. What you see here is a sanatorium which is still functional in the town of Gagra, which is relatively close to the Russian border. So Abkhazia certainly has a great deal of potential once its vacation possibilities are fully exploited. At this point it attracts largely Russian tourists, if any. Then, of course, on the flip side of the coin you have sites like this, which would once have been some kind of colliery, was my impression, but has come to a complete standstill. You really do get the impression that the thing was just switched off from one second to the next, and that nothing much has changed since, except perhaps for further deterioration in the building behind it. That quite clearly is a direct consequence of the first civil war then in the early 1990s. So in the same vein, you really don't have to look very hard to find leftovers from the conflict of the 1990s. This is already in the very centre of Sukhum, and you can imagine that there must have been quite some fighting going on there if you look at the pockmarks in the walls. And this image illustrates much the same thing. One has the impression it must have been quite attractive at one point, but these days it just stands there completely deserted because there's obviously no money to fix it. But again, one has the impression that wealthy Russians will sooner or later come in and start either fixing these things up or taking them down and building something new. As I mentioned earlier, because of its idyllic location, it was a very popular vacation spot during the Soviet era, and up and down the coast, particularly near Gagra, you have a great many now completely deserted but grand sanatoria or hotels. This is just one example of a great many. I suppose this was some kind of ballroom, and one doesn't have to use too much imagination to imagine how things might once have been inside it. But just in case your imagination wasn't up to the task, This image comes from the dining room of the functional sanatorium that you saw a little bit earlier on during the presentation. This is a photograph of a woman who was giving a very emotional speech during a national holiday in Abkhazia. It's just a photo of the local TV, and I happened to be there by complete coincidence during the 2008 conflict. So the conflict was on when she was making the speech, which made the entire atmosphere highly charged, and people were of course very emotional and less than happy with their Georgian neighbours at that particular time. Here we have a screen grab from the BBC. Actually, it's the infamous image of then Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili chewing his tie. This was while the conflict was still underway. If one sets aside the obviously very complex issues underlying the conflicts between South Ossetia and Georgia and Abkhazia, the fact is that there was certainly no excuse for Saakashvili's attack in the middle of the night upon South Ossetian civilians, which is what set this thing underway, so I must admit I have very little sympathy for him. Unless you're into cars, which I am not, the only interesting thing about this is the man in the white shirt, who at that time was Abkhazia's president, Sergei Bagapsh, who was expected to lead Abkhazia through its transformation, but ended up dying rather quickly of a lung ailment for which he was unsuccessfully treated in a Moscow clinic. He seemed quite hands-on. I spotted him inspecting all kinds of things around town, including footpaths and whatever, so without ever having met him, he did somehow have a nice vibe about him, I thought. Naturally enough, the first instinct when you come across sites like this is to laugh, not least because of the very obvious symbolism about things becoming derailed, but if you take the time, and not much time is required, to think a bit more deeply about how it came to this, the humorous aspect fades away relatively quickly. One thing that one inevitably ends up doing in Abkhazia is taking a stroll along the seafront of Sukhum, which is a very strange experience because the lack of funding to really rebuild the territory, region, country, however one wants to call it, has meant that the remnants of the war remain there, so one wanders past the most curious structures, of course again all of them shaded with sadness because of the underlying cause, but it does look like some kind of strange theme park now because the people have found a way to integrate all of it into their beach culture, and indeed managed to have quite some fun even with places that are imbued with an underlying sadness. This is one of the best examples of that. If you look around, it's not hard to locate file footage of refugee boats, very overloaded, filled with very distressed people trying to escape from the 1990s conflict, whereas now it is just a place for young people to relax and to jump into the sea. This image then is taken from up on the pier. The thing that appeals to me about this picture is that it has a kind of leap of faith feeling about it, and perhaps underlines for me at least the impression that the Abkhaz people are indeed very much the types who will take a leap where necessary. They seem to be very single-minded and very determined and willing to make sacrifices for their independence, and if you ask my opinion, I think it's quite unlikely that it will be reintegrated into Georgia anytime soon. This third image of the same pier catches a very similar sentiment, I suppose. One has to keep in mind that when it was taken, Abkhazia was indeed involved in a conflict, albeit with very strong support and protection from Russia. But even so, I have to say it was remarkable, I thought, how relaxed all the locals were. They just carried on with their normal day-to-day lives and activities and had fun and really did not seem particularly perturbed by what was going on their eastern border at all. Here is a picture of what is considered to be one of the principal attractions in Abkhazia. All the Russian guided tours take you here. It's the cathedral in Novi Afon. As far as I'm concerned, it's another Orthodox cathedral, and it's pretty, but probably not life-changing if you've seen similar such things in other locations. This was another rather strange vision. I just came across this child sitting completely by itself, no sign of any sort of parents anywhere, underneath a watchtower. Well, I think it's fair to say that he looks just as perplexed by the situation as I was. And just to round things out, an image of what one might call Abkhazia's future. So that's the Republic of Abkhazia. As I say, a very worthwhile destination. Very beautiful, but also quite distressing for obvious reasons. Hard to know where things are heading there, but one has the feeling that its position is consolidated now with Russia's very open backing at this time, and the people overall seem quite happy with their current situation. If you're interested, as I say, in these kinds of topics, please feel free to visit my website and have a look at more images of unusual locations that you may never visit for yourself. Okay, thank you very much, and bye bye.